The nearer I approached the target, the brighter it grew around me. A sea of light from the bright searchlights blinded me each time I made the slightest attempt to look down below. The flak shells crumped, some of them far above me, and I felt that I was now flying through hell. The first explosion made my machine quiver as a shell burst 50 yards ahead of me. The next moment the blast seized my me, 110 as with a giant's fist, and shook it. "Get busy, Rysop," I shouted. "Fire the recognition signals. The next one will get us." But already 2 green and 1 white flare had burst in the sky. "Are those bloody idiots trying to shoot us down?" roared Rysop, reloading his flare-pistol. Instinctively, I had put the machine into a steep left-hand turn. The next salvo burst beside us. "We're not going to make it as easy for you as that," I thought. Ahead of me, a cluster of searchlights were lighting up the sky. Hesitantly, the white beams flitted to and fro like the arms of an octopus until at last they had caught a bomber. The British machine was flying at about 14,500 feet and took no avoiding action. The gunners below made him their target, but they were shooting too far ahead. I decided to attack. Rysop quickly transmitted the code word, "Pork, pork," to the ground station. I dived from my superior altitude and got the bomber in my sights. The airspeed indicator needle rose to 330 mph. The bomber grew ever larger in the sights. Now I could clearly see the tall tail unit and the rear gunner's perspex turret. My machine came into the searchlight area, and a few well-aimed bursts lashed the bomber's fuselage, tearing off huge pieces of the fabric. The Tommy was on fire and turned over on its back. Everything happened in a flash. At incredible speed, I streaked past the burning British bomber and zoomed high into the sky to escape the threatening flak bursts. "Good stuff, Herr Leutnant. Good stuff," shouted Rysop, and reported our first victory to the ground station. "Wolfsburg from Buzzard 10, a Vickers Wellington shot down. Congratulations, Herr Leutnant. Carry on the good work, and perhaps we'll get another." A swift glance below. The Tommy had hit the deck and exploded. Fires had been caused among the harbour installations and were glowing scarlet in the glare of the searchlights. The other Britishers had seen their comrade go down in flames and lost their nerve in the fiery tempest over the city. The ground station reported the first return flights. Rysop suddenly called out, "There's one above us." I could only vaguely recognise the outlines of an enemy aircraft. What a miracle! We had spotted him without a searchlight, without radar, and without direction. The bomber was flying at a fairly high speed on a northerly course. My nerves were on edge. I forced myself to be calm and pulled up my nose. Slowly the monster drew closer, to 40, 30, 20 yards. We must have looked very small and insignificant compared with this mighty barn door, with its gigantic wings covering the sky. "It's a 4-engine, stammered Rysop. "We haven't seen this type before." I was now flying close below the bomber and took a breather. The enemy machine continued northwest on its homeward course, presumably quite unaware of the pursuer below. But I made a great mistake. The Tommy had long since spotted me. This was the first time that the short Stirling 4-engined bomber, carrying a 10-ton load, had appeared in the Ruhr zone. Our defence knew nothing of this type. Rysop and I were therefore unaware that beneath the fuselage sat a gunner with 2 heavy machine guns to protect this weak spot. In blissful ignorance we continued to fly below him, watching the glowing exhaust pipes of the 4 radial engines. "How shall we attack?" asked Rysop. I thought for a second and decided that the best method would be from below in order to let the bomber pass across my sights, and then to give him a good burst in the fuselage. The most dangerous moment would be when I zoomed behind his tail and the propeller slipstream of his engines caught my aircraft. I, therefore, had to aim vertically at his fuselage in order to put tail-end Charlie out of action. "It's time to fire," said Rysop. "Otherwise he'll spot us. Put your trust in God and wade in, Herr Leutnant." Those were his last words. I throttled back, let the bomber forge ahead, and put on top rudder. The protruding nose appeared in my sights. At the same moment, our bursts crossed. As out of a watering can, the enemy's tracers bore down on me from all the guns, completely blinding me. My aircraft was caught in the slipstream and tossed about like a scrap of paper. It was impossible to aim. The broadside of my Me-110 afforded the Sterling gunner an excellent target, and the bullets lashed my cockpit, fuselage, and petrol tanks. In a fraction of a second, my machine was transformed into a flaming torch. Scores of gallons of petrol were alight. The flames were already licking the cockpit. A machine gun salvo grazed my left leg and tore away the bundle of recognition flares attached to my left calf. The cockpit roof was torn off by the weight of the explosion and flew away. At this moment of almost certain death, I cast a glance at Rissop. He had slumped forward, lifeless, over his radio. The machine gun burst had killed him. My hope of getting out of the burning machine as it fell vertically into the yawning depths was very slight. The appalling heat in this sea of flames almost made me lose consciousness. I felt no fear. With a desperate effort, I hoisted my wounded leg out of the cockpit, but centrifugal force was too strong and forced me back into the aircraft. So I abandoned all hope of being saved and put my hands up to shield my eyes. After a dive of 9,000 feet, the aircraft exploded in the air and flung me out. As a burning torch, I hurtled through the air on my back. The cool night air lashed my face and revived me. Like a flash, the thought ran through my head. The parachute is on fire. The silk cords were still in the pack, protected from the greedy flames. I quickly put out the flames with both hands and tore off my flying boots and gloves. I got away with it. It was high time to open the parachute, for the red fires below seemed to be approaching at a terrifying speed. The earth drew closer and closer. A sudden jerk stopped my breathtaking fall. The parachute opened. My joy was indescribable, but it was soon to be dampened. The parachute was torn and had bullet holes in it. My nerves were at breaking point, and yet somehow I pulled myself together. I was now terribly afraid. During the dive, I had hardly had time to realize things, for they went too fast. But now, in this leisurely descent, I saw myself lying at any moment with broken limbs on some street pavement. And yet the earth did not seem to draw any nearer. One of the 16 lines was shot through and was fluttering in the wind. The parachute was on a slant in the air and threatened at any minute to Roman candle. That would have been the end. With my last strength, I tugged on the opposite lift webs and righted the canopy. During this last, desperate action, I crashed heavily into the water of a flooded meadow and sank up to the neck in the mud. Again, my luck held. The bad effects of my clumsy landing were offset by the soft soil. The cold water completely revived me. I fired my revolver into the air for someone to come and rescue me. Some men hurried up and freed me from my tricky situation. Then I fainted. When, after some hours, I opened my eyes, a sister was bending over me with a smile. I was saved. The worst was over. The head doctor of the hospital allowed me to take my first walk along the corridors. Supported by the sister, I looked out onto the gardens. The blossoms on the trees and the bright flowers of spring gave me a new urge to live. Only the thought of my trusty radio operator Rissop cast a shadow on my joy. The CO told me that they had had great difficulty in recovering Rissop's body. The nose of the machine, as it hit the ground like a torpedo, had bored deep into the marshy ground and taken Rissop down with it into the depths. The sister described what had happened since I had been brought into the hospital. "You worried us, Herr Leutnant. At 1:30 in the morning the telephone rang in my ward. A night fighter had been shot down and the pilot lay unconscious and badly wounded in a peasant house. You were soon brought here and our chief surgeon took you under his wing. Now we've patched you up, but you won't be able to fly again. Your eyes have suffered too much from the heat. Not until the burnt skin peeled from your face did the swelling go down. The doctor could then lift your eyelids and examine the skin below. One of the sisters wept for joy when he said that you would be able to see again." The sister's words aroused my deepest gratitude. After removing a host of splinters, the doctor managed to save my left leg, and I was able to walk again after 2 months. Despite second-degree burns, there was no trace of a scar on my face. Although I suffered a great deal of pain, my health improved day by day, and the new skin gradually replaced the old. Now I was climbing up towards life again and enjoying my convalescence. My thoughts turned to my squadron at Venlo and to my comrades. Should I ever be able to fly again? The sister's words became a nightmare. At last I was discharged, my limbs still aching, and with a new face, I set out on my leave for Bad Schachen. Our Group MO, Dr. Seeker, examined my eyes and smiled. "You've had a great stroke of luck, my dear Jonin," he said. "You'll be able to fly again in a fortnight, but don't get spotted a second time because you might not get out of it so well." My squadron commander gave me a new radio operator, Obergefreiter Ostreicher, a typical easy-going Viennese who was never ruffled. "Well, what do you know, Herr Leutnant?" he kept saying as we studied the fatal short Sterling. Every evening I sat with the young crews, working out the best methods of attacking this new type of bomber. By day I flew my new operational machine, Dora, to get accustomed to her. My inhibitions soon vanished, and I recovered my confidence in the machine. One warm summer evening in July 1942, the CO, after a conference with the station MO, put me on ops as reserve in Bertha sector. The fighter controller of this region, Oberleutnant Nickmeyer, telephoned and wished me good luck on my first op since the accident. My position in reserve gave me little hope of having a brisk encounter, and I had no expectations of meeting a Tommy that night. I was therefore slightly surprised when my Viennese radio operator stumbled into my hut with the words, "Herr Leutnant, get ready. The enemy's on the way. The boys are already airborne." "Okay," I replied, imitating his Viennese accent. "We'd better get a move on." I got dressed with quiet deliberation and made my necessary preparations. The raiders flew fairly high over our airfield in the direction of the Ruhr, dropping a few bombs on our installations by way of greeting. The fire engine was on the spot, and a few insignificant fires were soon under control. The ops room was in an uproar. Various lines were engaged, and each time the shooting down of a bomber was reported, there was a loud cheer. The CO was flying in Sector Bertha, which lay nearest to our airfield. This sector had the greatest number of penetrations recorded, a magnificent fighter controller, and the most bombers shot down. This was once more the case that night. The old man, after his second victory, reported heavy damage to his wings and engine. His adjutant, Oberleutnant Frank, took off immediately to relieve him. But the raiders had gone, and Frank had to wait for an hour over Bertha for their return flight. This period of waiting was always very boring. Radio silence was imposed because the wireless operator had to be prepared to receive orders from below at any minute. Our adjutant was at last relieved from the monotony by the first return flights and, emulating his superior, shot down a further 2 bombers. In the meantime, Ostreicher and I, as reserves in Dora, received orders to take off and engage the tail of the returning raiders should Oberleutnant Frank be put out of action. This precaution proved to be a wise one, for Frank had to make a premature landing owing to a damaged radio. "Well, we're off again," I thought, as I climbed to 12,000 feet, and this time without the flak. The nights are particularly bright in July. The Northern Lights proved fateful to the British. Out of 80 enemy bombers, 30 were brought down. Buzzard 10 from Bertha, enemy aircraft at 12,000 feet, course 280, fly on course 100. 2 couriers are entering your sector. This was my message from Oberleutnant Knickmeyer. I had a strange feeling as I heard these words. They reminded me of the night of 26th of March over Duisburg. Buzzard 10 from Bertha. Bank to port on course 280. Courier at your altitude. Give her full throttle. My thoughts quickly vanished at this call over the air, and the exciting search for the quarry began. They must be a few stragglers which had either been hit or were trying to catch up their comrades. At that moment, Nickmeyer called me again and ordered me to slow down. I had already overshot the British machines. I throttled back and lowered the flaps to break my speed. Enemy aircraft at 12,000 feet on the same course, 1 mile to stern. Fly at 200 Metziansen ph and keep your eyes open. Almost at stalling speed, I let the adversary approach, keeping my eyes on the bright horizon to the north. At last I saw a small shadow ahead. I dived immediately and got below him. This time I was not going to let him spot me. Surprise is half the battle. Once I had sighted the enemy, I felt quite calm. I was in no hurry, and I crept in closer and closer. The enemy bomber, a Vickers Wellington, was trundling wearily homewards. Nickmeyer reported that the second bomber was flying further to the north out of my sector. My operator chimed in at this moment. "Herr Lieutenant, fire into his wings. I'm sorry for those poor fellows." I had little sympathy with them when I thought of my earlier experience, and aimed the cross of my sights on the enemy's port engine. The distance decreased, 150, 100, 50 yards. The rear gunner fired a few bursts, but he could not aim properly because his pilot was taking avoiding action. The tracers flew across the sky like a necklace of broken beads. I stuck close on his tail and waited for a favourable moment. Now the bomber's wings were spread out against the northern sky as he went into a left-hand turn. At this moment I levelled my aircraft and let him fly into the cross wires of my sights. The left aileron appeared. I gave him a burst and his port engine was on fire. I had hit him and was waiting for the crew to bail out. But nothing happened. The fire appeared to have gone out. The pilot had probably cut out his port engine and was trying to get away on one. I must make another attack then. I had to lower my wing flaps to keep his speed. The Britisher seemed to be a wily old fox and tried to shake me off by stalling. Now I was hanging like a limp feather in the sky. Each of us was trying to fly even slower. I grew impatient and rashly attacked direct from the rear. The rear gunner was waiting for me to approach, and as we drew closer, my 2 cannon and 4 machine guns were pointed at his heavy machine guns. We opened fire at the same moment, and as the burning bomber dived earthwards, I noticed that my own plane had been hit. There was a smell of burning in the cockpit, but I could not see any flames. Suddenly my elevator jammed, and I dived steeply. It was a nasty situation. I let fly a juicy oath, and my Viennese must have taken this as an alarm signal, for when, after a 3,000-foot dive, my stick functioned once more, and I had the machine in control, a current of air blew through the cockpit. I looked behind, but my radio operator had bailed out, and his seat was empty. This was no great surprise. He had apparently found our dive a bit too hot and bailed out, on the principle that it was better to be alive hanging on a parachute than dead in the machine. Now that I had no radio, any further combat was out of the question. Without radio bearings or positional reports from the ground, I had to rely on my own instinct to bring my Dora safely home. My only hope was Nickmeyer. He would probably have noticed that something was wrong and have notified the surroundings airfields. After a quarter of an hour's flight between the Rhine and the Maas, I saw flares, radishes as we called them, being fired in the distance. In the meantime, Papa Hitgen had done everything in his power to lighten my task of finding the airfield. I finally landed, happy but sweating profusely, in the early morning hours at Venlo. I was received with shouts of joy by my friends, who informed me that my Viennese had landed safely, and reported my crash and his own rescue. When we next met, he naively said to me, "Well, sir, when you went into that power dive, you swore so terribly that I thought we've had it, and I took a quick powder." "Without even saying goodbye," I replied. Herr Lieutenant, I was in a hurry, you know, but I'm glad to see you're still alive." Courier was the German Air Force expression for any enemy aircraft. So far, the British night raids had caused comparatively little damage. The German armament industry was still working at full blast, and supplies were reaching the front line without interruption. The daily special communiques on the successes of the Wehrmacht allowed us to hope for an early final victory. Deep in enemy territory, the German soldier was fighting with incomparable idealism and rolling the enemy ever further back to the gates of Moscow and Cairo. But the lines of communication grew longer, and the occupied territories could only be lightly held. The home front worked like beavers to supply the soldiers at the front and to show them that they were not fighting on their own. The frontline soldiers believed that their dear ones were safe at home, and this gave them courage. However, of what use is courage in the long run against superior forces? As a result of Hitler's declaration of war on America in December 1941, the British now had a new and powerful ally. The British Isles experienced an American invasion such as had never before been seen. Aircraft, tanks, ships, guns, trucks, ammunition, medical supplies and transports full of soldiers arrived in the English West Coast harbours despite the great U-boat activity in the Atlantic. Airfields with mile-long runways sprang up like mushrooms. America's war production went into top gear, and her endless reserves were poured into the battle. The American tempo determined the strategic raids on Germany. Where runways were lacking, the Americans simply laid heavy, closely woven steel matting across meadows and fields. The same day, American fighters, Thunderbolts, Mustangs and Lightnings, took off from these temporary airfields, giving air cover to heavy bombers raiding the centre of Germany. The British flew by night and the Americans by day, a non-stop service. Impossible flying weather alone halted for a brief instant the offensive against the German home front. The German fighter arm could not compete with this mass attack. In feverish haste, new squadrons were formed, but of what use were young, inexperienced pilots in night fighting? Many of them fell out of the sky without ever having seen an enemy. And yet the few squadrons fought bravely. The outward and return flights of the enemy were marked by the wrecks of burning aircraft. The British suffered serious losses, but the gaps in their ranks were soon filled. Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans and Americans reinforced the bomber groups. Each night death spread its wings over another German city. Each morning brought tears of despair and terror of the approaching night. The night fighter crews could no longer think of sleep, for the enemy often came twice in one night. After the first mission we landed on some airfield, refueled and took off once more against the enemy. Ops lasted from 4 to 6 hours. In the early morning the exhausted crews fell into their bunks and slept, until the Americans arrived in their silver birds. Alert, the night fighters also had to take part in the daylight defence. Hardly had they slept a few hours to rest their nerves after the excitement of the night than the air raid sirens roused them, and they scrambled for their aircraft. The unequal struggle began. The American fast fighters against the slow, clumsy German night fighters. The air throbbed with the drone of engines from bombers flying in close formation. Scores of fast fighters watched over their heavy charges, which flew on their course without deviation. As soon as the first German fighters appeared, they dived on the enemy, and within a few seconds a dogfight was in progress. In this mad chaos, the night fighter squadrons, in close formation, tried to approach the bombers. The gunners had the difficult task of keeping off the constant attacks of American fighters. It was a disastrous mêlée. Friend and foe hurtled in flames out of the sky, until in the late afternoon the American bomber stream turned on its course for home. Losses on both sides were appalling. Many of our night fighter pilots who so far had fought magnificently in the darkness now fell in daylight combats. Until dusk we had a few hours' rest and relaxation, and then the performance began again. Our night fighter wing No. 1 in Venlo fought magnificently. Hauptmann Streib, Oberleutnants Timmick, Frank, Kanaka, Wandam, Grieser and Luz were the wing aces. Night and day in bitter air battles, Kanaka engaged one Britisher after the other, and won the Knight's Cross. Despite British air supremacy, the crews and ground staff continued to carry out their duties with enthusiasm. The comradeship between officers, crews, and ground staff was magnificent. Each man who had been home on leave and experienced the night bombing carried out his duty more fanatically and conscientiously than ever. And yet, the gaping wounds no longer healed. Cities were pulverized, and bombing warfare gradually undermined the resistance of the people. Everything that men held dear went up in flames. Huge expanses of a city were often erased in a single night. Century-old buildings with priceless collections, castles, churches, schools, factories, private houses and stations disintegrated. The monstrous juggernaut of fire sucked the terrified people into its wake and consumed them. The cities of Münster, Karlsruhe and Essen suffered grievously in the summer of 1942 from concentrated bombing attacks. On his return from leave in Karlsruhe, one of my comrades gave his own account of the 3rd September raid. At 02:10 hours, the sirens wailed. Very few of the townspeople stumbled out of their warm beds and sought the protection of the air raid shelters. What was the good? In comparison with the big industrial cities, Karlsruhe was unimportant, and the British would at most be making a feint for a nuisance attack. But suddenly, even the most cool-headed citizen felt anxious as a deafening roar of engines made the air above this old residence town quiver. "The Tommies are over the city!" ran the alarm cry through the streets and houses. The first bombs exploded in the centre of the city, causing a panic among the population. Everyone rushed in despair to the air raid shelters, and the wardens had the greatest difficulty in keeping order. Our flak gunners fired like maniacs into the night sky without inflicting any serious damage on the bombers. Street after street went up in flames. Tears welled in the eyes of the citizens the following morning when they saw the tragic damage. The first doubts as to our war leadership began to rise, and many people lost their faith in the Hitler regime. Wild rumours ran round the city. "I think," my friend who had returned from leave said at the end of his shattering report, "that the enemy has achieved his first objective, to destroy the morale of the home front." How was this overwhelming attack by the Allied air forces to be halted? The problem remained unchanged, the discovery of the enemy by night. Out of the 1,000 oncoming bombers, flying in close formation through the sectors covered by individual night fighter squadrons, only a fraction were caught in the searchlight beams, and of these only a few were shot down by fighters. The majority of the bombers flew undetected on the outward and return journey from England over Holland and Belgium to Germany. The night fighter arm was too closely bound to the individual sectors and too limited in its radius of action. The British, by means of their secret service, had soon discovered the danger sectors and knew the weak spots in our defence from the reports of their own crews. What was the result? The Allied squadrons started from every airfield in England, assembled over a certain beacon in the North Sea, and then flew at short intervals, almost goose-stepping towards the weakest night fighter areas. Then they crashed by sheer weight through this area like a broad stream driven through a narrow channel. Our whole night defence was crippled by these approach tactics. Since the broad zone of defence stretching from Paris over Flensburg was useless, it had to become more elastic. But how? As long as the night fighter pilot had to rely on a machine being caught in the searchlights and could not find his opponent by his own efforts, he was virtually helpless. The morale of the crews, which cruised around at night, unable to interfere while the Britishers broke through en masse perhaps 20 miles away, sank to zero. And then, at last, came salvation. Berlin sent us the first night fighter machines equipped with their radar, and moreover with an unlimited radius of action. Feverishly, the electro-engineers had developed an apparatus that sent out electric beams on ultra-short waves into space. The path of the beam from transmitter to a metal object and back to the receiver took a fraction of a second, was measured by the apparatus, and evaluated visibly on cathode ray tubes. This miracle machine aroused great excitement throughout the whole night fighter arm. Rumours were rife, and many people believed that machines would eventually be put into service equipped with death rays. This rumour was not so wild as it appears, for although the Liechtenstein apparatus, it was known as Lee in night fighter circles, did not send out death rays, it seized the opponent with invisible arms and drew him towards itself as an octopus catches its prey. The death blow from the night fighter's cannon followed. The radio operators were sent on courses to learn how to use the new instrument. Although the assembly and the instrument itself were highly complicated, it was very simple to use. The outstanding feature of the Lee was the long antennae in the nose of the plane, which the pilots soon nicknamed the barbed wire. The field covered by these antennae was 30 degrees above and below and 60 degrees to port and starboard. The enemy aircraft was picked up by the apparatus at a distance corresponding to its own altitude. Thus, if the night fighter was flying at 13,000 feet, the wireless operator could see the enemy plane on his screen at a distance of 4,400 yards. Naturally, the machine itself was not visible, only the so-called zigzags. Since the distance alone would be of little use to the night fighter, vertical and lateral zigzags appeared on 2 further screens, making 3 pictures in all. For the wireless operator, the handling of this apparatus, in addition to his other tasks such as radio compass and fix bearings, communication with the ground staff and over the RT, entailed an enormous amount of extra work. Moreover, the light blue flickering cathode ray tubes dazzled the eyes so much that the radio operator, after using the radar for half an hour, could no longer recognize the stars in a clear sky. Thus the pilot and the gunner had to keep an even greater watch on their sector. The installation of this apparatus also demanded increased cooperation and mutual understanding between the fighter controller and the wireless operator. Previously, the pilot had been completely free to make his own decisions, but now he had to rely on the reports of his operator to follow the course according to the radar measurements. At the same time, the use of the Lee resulted in a complete change in night fighter tactics. The sectors were retained, but the direction of the fighters was now entrusted to high-ranking ground officers. The tactics were basically altered so that the night fighter was no longer led into a certain limited sector, but the entire ops group was assembled on the Channel coast above a heavy transmitting beacon which lay on the known approach route of the enemy. The wing commanders agreed with their squadron commanders upon a secret frequency. The latter, in turn, got into communication with their crews. Thus the CO could report to ground headquarters in a comparatively short time that his wing was ready to take off. In the most favourable conditions, the entire night fighter arm, graded at varying altitudes, circled above the beacon on the coast, and was dispatched from there at short intervals against the oncoming bomber stream. One might say that the cards had been well shuffled, and the Liechtenstein apparatus could begin to function. In addition to the Earth picture or Earth zigzag, which appeared constant on all 3 tubes and signified that the enemy machine was only the distance of their own altitude away, the radio operator, once directed into the bomber stream, could now pick up the enemy machines. Pictorially described, the electric beams of the radar explored the ether and reported to the operator in fractions of a second the altitude, distance, and quarter of the enemy aircraft. If, for example, 800 bombers and 100 night fighters were in the stream, there was always the danger that instead of the opponent, the radar beam would pick up one of their own fighters flying ahead. But the inventor had foreseen this and added an additional gadget which made it possible to distinguish between friend and foe. With this new weapon, the night fighter could pursue his opponent from the Channel to the target and back to the English coast, as long as he remained in the bomber stream and did not run out of fuel. The ground stations continually gave the position of the raiders so that the night fighters always knew the air situation and, if necessary, could be directed into the bomber stream once more. Various airfields were notified and turned on their lights as soon as a fighter got into trouble or ran out of juice. With the introduction of the Lee, an intensive battle was waged against the enemy in which every available night fighter took part. The migratory period had set in for the crews, and it was not unusual for pilots from France, Belgium, Germany or Denmark to meet on a Dutch airfield. In the grey light of dawn, they then proceeded back to their own airfields. One night, fighter was so absorbed in his task that he followed the enemy bomber stream to England and, having run out of fuel, had to force land on a British airfield. For the Allies, the introduction of this new apparatus was almost a catastrophe. The goose step had suddenly become a death march. On 17th of November 1942, at about 23 yarn hours, there was great excitement among the crews at Venlo. The topic of the day was the Liechtenstein apparatus and the secret operation Adler. The division had given the order. Various squadrons of night fighters equipped with the new radar will take off in close formation against the enemy. Shortly before the start, the crews will be given the position of the enemy bomber stream and assemble over a beacon on the coast, flashing the code signal LI. From this point onwards, they will be introduced into the British bomber stream, which must be decimated before it reaches the target. Each crew is to pursue the enemy to the last drop of fuel. The orders were quite clear. Oberleutnant Knacker and his wireless operator Ho ran over once more all the details and the possibilities that might arise on this new mission. All the airfields were carefully marked on the map, for as yet no one knew which city the British would attack that night. It might be Kiel, or again, it might be Frankfurt am Main. There was a feverish discussion as to the possibilities of success. "Not a single machine will get back to England," one of them maintained. This was obviously an exaggeration, but everyone felt there was something in the air. After their insignificant successes on recent ops and the terrible destruction of the German cities, it was the obvious duty of the crews to make the most of this new invention. 23:20 hours. The coastal ground stations reported the start of strong bomber formations from the Midlands. Readiness for all 30 serviceable machines and crews. One operator reported that his Lee was not working. A special radio car hastened over to the aircraft and checked the complicated mechanism. The fault was soon found, and the machine was declared ready for ops at 23:45 hours. The loudspeaker reported, "The British bomber formations are assembling in map square 23, long 2°20, lat 52°32s. Strength of the formation, circa 600 aircraft. Altitude 15,000 feet. All aircraft proceed to beacon LI at Scheveningen on the Channel coast." At 23:46 hours, Oberleutnant Knacker was the first to take off. He turned onto course 200 without making a circuit round the field. He switched off his navigating lights, and his machine was swallowed up in the darkness. A clear, starry sky lay over Holland, ideal weather for night fighters. Knacker did not spare his aircraft and rose at 18 feet per second to the prescribed altitude. Unteroffizier Ho called his squadron mates on the intercom. "Buzzard 5 from Buzzard 1, come in." Buzzard 1 from Buzzard 5. Victor, message received. Am on course 200. One after the other, the planes reported. Knacker called up the CO and received a reply. Hauptmann Streib ordered complete radio silence to prevent the British from having any suspicions of their presence. The ground station reported 3 other night fighter wings in the air. At 00:10 hours, the order to attack was given. All aircraft fly on course, 180. The leading bombers are flying over the coast west of Rotterdam on course 90. Probable objective the Ruhr, enemy altitude 16,500 feet. Oberleutnant Knacker turned on his radar, set his course at 180, and came down to 16,500 feet. Within 5 minutes he would meet the leading bombers. The first real test of the new radar eye had begun. Unteroffizier Ho eagerly watched the pictures on the cathode ray tubes. At the outset, only the ground zigzag appeared, giving a regular jagged line on the lower screen of the tube. Tension rose. For 6 minutes flying time had already elapsed. Then the miracle occurred. From starboard to port, a fine jagged line travelled above the ground picture into the side cathode ray tube. The enemy. Hugh was wild with excitement. He immediately gave his pilot a change of course to 90°, and behold, as the machine turned, the enemy line retreated from starboard to port and remained in the centre of the tube. The bomber was, therefore, directly ahead. The distance tube showed 4,000 yards, and the altitude tube 16,350 feet. Naka could not believe that the Britisher was already pinpointed at this great distance. He peered out in the direction of his opponent but could not see him, for the vision of the human in the dark is not more than 100 to 200 yards. His nerves were at breaking point. Would the Tommy be able to break out of his radar field? No, for the crews were still flying calmly towards the defence zone and would only be at action stations once the first searchlight was turned on. The pilot was taking no avoiding action. Naka gave full throttle. The distance decreased from 4,000 to 3,500 to 3,000 and to 2,500 yards. Suddenly, Hugh reported a new contact at 2,000 yards distance. A British machine had crossed their field slowly, from north to south. For a moment, Naka was uncertain which opponent to pursue. Then he decided upon the nearest bomber. The big enemy zigzags showed up wonderfully in the tubes. The machine had begun to weave and was now travelling on the screen alternately from port to starboard and back. Could the crew have noticed anything? That was impossible. The distance decreased to 500 and to 300 yards. Cautiously, Nak throttled down and looked out on all sides. Hugh gave him the final Lee readings. Opponent 200 yards ahead, 50 feet above us. Then he could no longer endure the light in the apparatus. But the Britisher was still invisible to the human eye. 3 pairs of eyes scanned the sky for his shadow. The situation was not without its dangers. There were always the dangers of a collision or of being spotted first. Naka grew nervous since he still could not see the enemy. Hugh looked once more in his apparatus. The zigzags were now gigantic on the distant screen. The bomber must now be very close to the pursuing night fighter. Naka gave a start. Straight ahead and a little above him, he had caught sight of the barely visible shadow of a 4-engined bomber. Now he must take care. The Britisher had not spotted him. The mighty shark's fins on the tail unit were clearly outlined against the night sky. A short Sterling. She carried 8 to 10 tons of explosives in her bomb bays ready to drop on the Ruhr. Naka did not hesitate for a second, but waded in. Bright flames spurted from the engines and tanks. A second burst tore open the fuselage and probably killed the crew. In the ghostly light, he could see the red, white and blue circles on the body of the aircraft just before it plunged with its bomb load into the depths. This kill had the effect of a nightmare beam upon his fellow pilots now attacking the bomber stream. The plane exploded with a bright scarlet flash in the harbour of Rotterdam. And now a terrifying half-hour began for the enemy. Everywhere in the sky could be seen the flash of tracers from heavy machine guns and cannon. 3, 4, 5 enemy bombers hurtled on fire earthwards. The path of their flight from Rotterdam to the Ruhr was strewn with blazing wrecks. The Lee machine had proved itself to be a precision instrument. Within half an hour, Naka had shot down 4 bombers. Then he had a terrifying experience. Hugh reported a contact at 2,000 yards. Naka attacked at full speed. He caught up with his opponent and in the darkness suddenly caught sight of the British rear gunner's Perspex cockpit. In his excitement, Naka fired immediately into the full petrol tanks. The British rear gunner lost his head, left his machine guns and bailed out, landing right in the propeller of the pursuing night fighter. There was a dull thud, which made Nak's plane shudder. The engine began to vibrate so badly that he had to cut it out. He landed his clumsy Me 1110 at Venlo on one engine. Mechanics rushed over and lit up the machine. By the light of their torches, they could still see traces of blood and hair on the propeller. Strips of uniform were hanging on the antennae of the Lee. The fate of the British gunner upset everyone. Over 100 bombers lay that night as wrecks on Dutch soil. The invisible Lee rays had broken up a mass attack on the Ruhr that night and had been disastrous to the British crews. Oberleutnant Reinhold Kanaka, the ace of Night Fighter Wing No. 1, was born in Strelitz on January 1, 1919. The young squadron leader shot down 43 of the enemy by night in bitter air combats over Holland. His successes were several times reported in the Wehrmacht communiques, but the operations eventually began to fray his nerves. Kanaka felt this and led an incredibly ascetic life. He neither drank nor smoked, and in the rest periods kept fit by playing games with his fellow pilots. One February night in 1943, the fate of this modest, conscientious flying officer was sealed. His CO had just recommended him for the Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross, but the decoration was awarded to him posthumously. After a bitter fight with a 4-engined Halifax, the enemy bomber and the night fighter plunged together into the depths. The British rear gunner opened fire at exactly the same moment as Naka, and the bursts on both sides were fatal. In the early morning, the troops found the crews and debris of both machines lying next to each other in a field. During this successful period with the new radar apparatus against the RAF, I was posted in December 1942 with No. 3 Squadron of Night Fighter Wing No. 1 to Parchim. This order came as a complete surprise, for during my 18 months with this wing, I had grown very attached to it. The squadron's successes and the tough times we had experienced together, as well as the moments of triumph, had forged strong bonds between the pilots. Parchim is in Mecklenburg, and so far had been left unscathed by the war. The landscape and the inhabitants radiated peace and contentment. After the exciting ops in Holland, I felt as though I had been sent on permanent leave. The Parchim CO was obviously delighted to see us arrive. The full sheds were cleared of the old training machines, and now served to house brand new night fighter types which had just arrived from Gotha. The extremely well-equipped workshop was adapted to service our Messerschmitts. The entire airfield installations were renovated to deal with night fighter activities. By Christmas 1942, the wing was fully equipped and at full complement. The backbone of No. 3 Night Fighter Wing No. 6 was the veteran operational squadron from Venlo. The officer commanding this new night fighter wing was Hauptmann Schönert, an officer of experience. Nearly all the crews were fresh from training school. We flew every night and no time was lost, for even the younger pilots realized why they were in Parchim, to protect the German capital from the coming terror raids. Most of the boys from the flying schools were magnificent airmen. Flying was in their blood. Hauptmann Schönert realized his luck in being able to prepare his crews for ops in peace and quiet, without enemy interference. What would have happened to these young pilots had they been flung immediately into action as soon as they left school? The answer had already been seen in the West. Night after night the youngsters did not return while the veterans continued to pile up their victories, and yet the rookies in Parchim did not realize how lucky they were. On the contrary, they cursed this god-forsaken hole and the boring peacetime conditions. Hauptmann Schönert used to say, "It is a fine thing to die a hero's death, but you are far more used to your country as a pilot." In the West, the battle between the armies continued with undiminished vigour. In May 1943, a message came from the division. The West needs reinforcements. Since in the short summer nights only attacks on the Ruhr could be envisaged, Fighter Corps assembled the experienced crews on the Dutch and Belgian airfields. I, too, was posted to the West. My crew was delighted. The fellows who remained behind were very depressed when they said goodbye to us. Our crates were stuffed to bursting point with everything the airman needs when he is posted: wireless set, a dog, washing and toilet utensils, schnapps cupboard, and a good many other things. Space was cramped in the aircraft. The radio operator and gunner sat huddled together in the rear cockpit. Our Me-110 looked more like a furniture van than a streamlined night fighter. Hedge-hopping over the airfield, we dipped our wings in farewell to those who remained behind and set our course westwards. At dusk, about 1933 hours, I landed on the big airfield of Gilze near Breda and reported to the CO, Hauptmann Frank, an old friend from my Venlo days. It was a pleasant reunion. Among my new mates were the successful long-distance night fighters Lieutenant Heinz Strüning, Bussmann and Oberfeldwebel Gildner. Strüning, with Cologne wit, told me of his experiences as a night fighter over England. In 1941 and 1942, These courageous pilots hovered over English airfields and shot down the bombers just as they came into land. Uncle Heine, as we called him because he was older than ourselves, relived his adventures as he told them to us. "Boys," he said jestingly, "there were so many Tommies circling the airfield that we could have knocked them out of the skies with our caps." One evening in July 1943, we were all in our bomb-proof dugout waiting for ops. Strunning entered and burst out, "Boys, have I had a laugh? A real blue-blooded aristocrat blew in today, but let me sit down." Suddenly we heard the faint drone of engines, which increased in strength until they were directly overhead. A loud hiss, and we all lay flat on the floor. Bombs. The light flickered and went out. Crump. The next stick was quite close. By rights we should have jumped into the trench, but no one gave it a thought. In the dugout we were protected from splinters, and why should the bombs fall directly on the roof? Uncle Heine lit a candle and went on with his story. "I was sitting with Hauptmann Frank this afternoon when a tall, thin captain strolled in. 'Good morning, Frank,' he said with a drawl. 'I'm Wittgenstein, and I've been posted to your squadron. What's cooking? Where is there something to shoot down?' He's in a hurry, I thought to myself. At the same moment he introduced himself to me. 'Ah, my friend,' said our OC, rather bewildered. 'I suppose you're Prince Wittgenstein, the former bomber pilot?' 'Quite right, my dear Frank, but drop the prince, just call me Wittgenstein. Have my machine put near control so that I can take off at once.' A madman, I thought, as I took my leave. Once outside I got into conversation with the prince's crew. Among other things, they told me that their princely coachman had recently made his radio operator stand to attention in the plane and confined him to his quarters for 3 days because he had lost the picture in his screen during a mission. Since he shot down 3 bombers shortly afterward, he pardoned the man and awarded him the Iron Cross First Class. All this took place at 15,000 feet, right in the middle of the English bomber stream. 'There's no holding the prince once he's in the air,' they said. 'He takes off like a maniac and only lands when he hasn't a drop of juice left.' The following day I had the pleasure of flying with him in Beaver Sector. When we met over the beacon, he sent me the following message. 'You stick here by the beacon, I'm off hunting.' Since he was a captain and I was only a lieutenant, I could not disobey, but I went off hunting all the same. Obituary. Heinrich Prinz zu Sein-Wittgenstein was one of the most successful night fighter pilots, and his name was bracketed with those of Major Streib and Lent. But the ambition of this eager and outstanding airman was to be head of the night fighter elite. Spurred on by his need for action, the young group commander shot down 84 enemy bombers in tough air battles. But his 84th victory, actually his 5th kill on the night of 21st January 1944, led him not to his coveted position, but to his death. Directly after his 5th victory that night, he was attacked and shot down by a British night fighter. The prince gave orders to his crew to bail out and tried to save his aircraft. He failed. Recognizing the danger too late, he bailed out just before the burning machine crashed. On the following day, his body was found near the wreckage. Major Heinrich Prinz zu Sein-Wittgenstein, born on 14th of August 1916 in Copenhagen, decorated with the oak leaves and swords to the Knight's Cross, will be remembered by all night fighter pilots as a courageous and exemplary airman. A warm, mild breeze blew through the musty barracks and attracted us outside. Engines were being revved up at the far end of the airfield. "Ha ha," said Uncle Heine. "Those are our remaining bombers, which have not yet been destroyed on the ground. The poor crews are now off to England. I recently had a chat with one of their NCO pilots. They're really to be pitied. In the old days, they set out in armadas of between 400 and 600 aircraft, and today there are only about 100 of them left. Moreover, those old crates are out of date and an easy prey for the British night fighters. If 30 of them set out tonight, probably only 20 would return." Our proud bomber formations in the west had sunk lamentably. Some of them were sent to the Eastern Front, and the rest were decimated night after night without receiving sufficient reinforcements. The Allies had won air supremacy not only over the British Isles, but also over German territory. Even the simple soldier now began to reflect upon the failure of the Luftwaffe. His incipient doubts, however, were still stifled by skillful propaganda. The high-ranking Nazi officers gave lectures on the new V1 and V2 weapons. "There is no further need now," they insisted, "for us to fly to England. We shall soon bring the British to their knees with our V1. Until then, the German soldier must stick it out and do his best to protect the fatherland from further losses. Long live the Führer." Always the same words. Stick it out, stick it out. The night fighter squadrons really gave of their best. From the group captains to the youngest corporal pilots, they took off night after night against the enemy. The ground staff taxed themselves to the limit to get all the machines serviceable before nightfall. In the machine age, all effort and sacrifices on the part of the squadrons are of no avail when they lag behind the enemy in technical progress. What we needed were faster and better day fighters, bombers, or night fighters. Was it not a disgrace to our leaders that the Tommy could fly longer and at a greater speed over the Reich than our own fighters? In 1940, our Me-209s and Focke-Wulfs fought on even terms with the Hurricanes and Spitfires. But how was it now in 1943? They still took off in the same Me-109s and Focke-Wulfs, although in improved types, against faster enemy machines such as Thunderbolts, Mustangs, Mosquitoes, and Lightnings. The Allies now used their Hurricanes and Spits as training machines. We asked ourselves daily why the Luftwaffe was not equipped with turbojets, the plans of which already lay in Professor Messerschmitt's locker in 1941. Were they going to delay until it was perhaps too late? These were our gloomy thoughts as we sat waiting for the next night ops. The British had hardly started when we received the order. Readiness for all machines. The Tommy was airborne. Irzeroint 50 hours. Orders to take off. I flew on a direct course to Schouen Island and climbed to 15,000 feet. Beaver headquarters reported the first radar contacts. 01.00 hours. My radio operator Facius reported a Tommy 1,000 yards away flying due west. Full throttle. The enemy machines swiftly approached. We were now directly over the coast. The sea glittered pale in the moonlight, and the land lay in complete darkness. My Me-110 was caught in the first propeller slipstreams. Now I had to keep my eyes skinned. Facius gave the latest reports. Enemy 50 yards ahead at our altitude. Within a matter of seconds, I saw the glowing exhaust pipes, 8 of them. Ah, a 4-engined bomber. I did a shallow dive until I was 150 feet below the Tommy. Facius had already recognized the type, a Halifax. I attacked and hit the left wing with my first burst. The flames spurted from the tanks, and I could clearly see red, white, and blue circles. The burning bomber hurtled like a comet down to earth, and the hunt went on. 01:43 hours. Another picture on our screen. Facius did a good job. Slowly we stalked the opponent, 1,000 yards, 600, 200, 100, and I could already see the dark shadow. Another Halifax. A minute later, this bomber too had been dispatched on fire. Silence then reigned over the air. A few moments later, Beaver headquarters reported a heavy attack on Cologne. The dispersed British squadrons met over Cologne. I received orders from the ground station to circle over the Beaver beacon and wait for their return flight. In the far distance on the west horizon, we could see a bright glow in the sky. The bombs were falling on the cathedral city. Beaver soon reported the first returning bombers. Long before they reached the coast, the British lost height in order to cross the channel at a greater speed and reach the haven of their own coast. Falcon 10 from Beaver. Come in. I gave my altitude and course. Falcon 10. Fly on course 280. Enemy aircraft at 9,000 feet. Couriers losing height. I reacted at once and set off in pursuit. The distance was still 6,000 yards. I dived steeply and gave more throttle. Facius set the aerial arms of the lee in action, exploring the air around him. Suddenly, jagged lines appeared on the screen. Beaver reported, "Enemy flying at full speed for the coast. Give her full throttle." "Do you think he'll get away?" asked my radio operator. "No, he mustn't get away," I replied. The engines roared and my speed rose to 310 mph. Slowly we caught up with the enemy. "He's turned," reported Facius. The jagged lines on the cathode ray tubes kept swinging from port to starboard and back. We were already over the sea at 6,000 feet. I gambled everything on one card and set the throttle at full power. At this stress, the engines would only last for a bare 5 minutes. Facius stopped his watch. My plane bucked and shuddered. The vibrations and the rough running of the engines were communicated to the crew. Those were the moments of greatest tension. At any moment one could reckon with a disaster. Facius reported calmly, "We're closing in fast. Enemy 1,000 yards ahead." Now one of us had only 10 minutes more to live, for there was no chance of rescue over the sea. One of us must go down, for that was the law of warfare. 600 yards now, reported Facius. Enemy flying on the same course and losing height. A swift glance at my altimeter. It showed 3,600 feet. We were at a ticklish height. It was only a matter of seconds when one had to bail out of a burning machine. The parachute needed time to open. The Mae West had to be blown up before bailing out, or else it sank like a lump of lead. Distance 400 yards. Well, no use thinking about it. Bright moonlight astern favoured the Tommy. He had the greatest chance of spotting us first. For this reason, I took up my position on his quarter, so as not to receive a full blast from. The rear gunner's armaments. Facius reported, distance 150 yards, altitude 2,400, enemy dead ahead. And there he was. The bomber's shark fins gleamed in the bright moonlight. At the same moment, the Tommy had spotted me and banked savagely to port. The life-and-death struggle began. Hardly was I in firing position than the bomber zoomed. His wing surfaces grew enormous, as though appealing for help to the dark night sky. But I kept on his tail. As he zoomed, the enemy's fuselage came fully into my sights. I fired, but in a flash he recognized the danger and went into a steep dive. The sweat was pouring down my cheeks. My altimeter showed only 900 feet. The British pilot pulled out just above the water at the very last moment. Now he was too low to dive again. The pilot weaved like a maniac to disturb my aim. The crew were firing madly with all their guns, and the tracers framed my machine. Now it was a question of keeping a cool head. I dived right down to the water. As a result of this manoeuvre, the Tommy probably lost sight of me. For a moment he flew on an even keel. Then I zoomed and pressed the button of my cannon and machine guns. A giant blue flame spurted from the port petrol tank, and the bomber crashed with its crew into the sea. My crew breathed with relief. They had lived through these anxious moments without being able to do anything. No one said a word as we circled above the scene of the crash. A bright red gurgle of water, and once more darkness and silence. Slowly I climbed to 3,000 feet and flew in the direction of the Dutch coast. Facius called Beaver headquarters, but they did not hear us, for our fight had carried us too far out to sea. After this third victory, I was all in. Only one idea remained in my head: to get home, to land, and to sleep. At last, Beaver replied. "Beaver from Falcon 10, I called. Third kill, a Vickers Wellington shot down over the sea in Map Square IG-33, on my way home." At 02:47 hours, I touched down on the flare path at Gilsarine. I hardly heard the congratulations of my fellow pilots. In the huts, I met Heinz Strünning. "My God, Jonin," he said. "I was over Cologne. It was a gruesome sight. The whole city was a sea of flames. Let's hope my wife and children are still alive. If things go on like this, we shall soon be in a real mess. This was the first time I had seen our cheerful Heine look serious. We wandered slowly back to our huts. The night wind cooled our heated foreheads. "Good night, Heine. Off again tomorrow, I suppose?" "Night," he replied, "but I hope it won't be over Cologne." By a lucky coincidence, I landed once more at my old station, Venlo. What a change I found in Night Fighter Wing No. 1. My former CO, Major Strabe, was delighted to see me. Very few of his trusty veterans were still alive. The men with experience had been dispersed in all directions and formed the backbone of the Night Fighter Wings from Paris to Flensburg. New faces greeted me. The once chivalrous combat waged by the night fighters, which spoke well for the fair disciplined training of the airmen under the pressure of the terrible losses inflicted on the civilian population by round-the-clock bombing, had developed into a ruthless warfare in which no quarter was given. The pilots' faces had grown hard, and no trace of youthfulness remained. Major Strabe, the most successful night fighter wing commander, had now shot down 66 enemy bombers and had been awarded the oak leaves with swords to his Knight's Cross. The previous night, within a short time, he had managed to increase his score by 5 thanks to our new night fighter plane, the Ep.2. Later he met with an accident on landing. This Heinkel type, originally developed thanks to the energy of General Kamhuber in cooperation between Night Fighter Command, troops and industry, still had teething troubles. Although the pilot's demands for high speed, powerful armament, good range and visibility had been fulfilled, this prototype developed faults in design. At high speeds, the tail unit began to wobble. The fuselage had been lengthened to overcome this. Strabe flew this machine from its 7th test flight onwards. On the previous night, the He-219 had been in action for the first time. 5 bombers were brought down, but on landing, although the machine had not been hit, various instruments were put out of action. The wing flaps also failed to function. They could be lowered to landing position, but immediately rose to normal flight. Strabe, therefore, was obliged to land at a very great speed. When the machine touched down with a bump on the concrete runway, the starboard engine broke away from the wing. There was a deafening report. The He literally broke in pieces. Wings and fuselage collapsed. The Perspex cockpit came away from the body and whirled with the pilot 50 yards through the air. Fortunately, Strabe was uninjured. The fire engine and ambulance men hurried up to free his radio operator, Unteroffizier Fischer, from the wreckage. By some miracle, he too was unhurt. The pair of them were astonishingly lucky. On 27th of July 1943, there was something in the air. The early warnings from the Freya apparatus on the Channel coast indicated a large-scale British raid. In the late afternoon, various flak units, night fighter wings, and civilian air raid posts had been given orders to have their full complement at action stations. What were the British up to? What city that night would be the victim of these well-prepared raids? Every ominous presentiment was to be fulfilled that night. In all ignorance, the night fighter squadrons took off against the British bombers, whose leaders were reported over northern Holland. I was on ops and flew in the direction of Amsterdam. On board, everything was in good order, and the crew was in a cheerful mood. Radio operator Facius made a final check and reported that he was all set. The ground stations kept calling the night fighters, giving them the positions of the bombers. That night, however, I felt that the reports were being given hastily and nervously.